The store was still dark. The door was locked. Her phone was on the car seat, but Amber was gone. That was what a co-worker discovered on a Monday morning in San Antonio, Texas. A seemingly normal morning had begun a series of haunting days that lasted more than a year. Amber Belkin, a 25-year-old video game store manager, was known to everyone as a hard worker, an animal lover, and a forward-thinking person. No one expected that morning to be the last time anyone would see her alive. The city was quiet, the air heavy. No one heard a scream. There was no sign of a break-in. But something was clearly wrong. This is one of those cases that haunts both the police and the public for a long time. If you are interested in stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories. That morning, Amber left home at the usual time. She was always the first to open the store, check the books, take money from the safe to deposit, and rearrange the shelves. Everything was part of the familiar routine of a dedicated manager. But behind the closed door that day, a tragedy was silently waiting. Sometime later, Giovanni, a person who used to work with Amber, was asked to check. He reported that the door was closed, the lights were off, and nothing unusual was seen outside. The scene was later described as chaotic. CD cases were scattered, the safe was wide open, and a few bills were scattered. But the real shock was behind the office door, where Amber was found lying motionless, with no signs of life. At first, this was thought to be a robbery that had serious consequences. However, a series of details began to fall apart. There was no sign of forced entry, some valuables were not taken, and most importantly, the door was locked from the outside. These suspicions quickly caused the initial hypothesis to be questioned. The police reviewed work schedules, investigated employees, and examined images from cameras in neighboring stores. The atmosphere within the team became heavy as everyone gradually realized that the killer could be someone very familiar. Small clues, such as the last text message Amber sent, the time the phone was disconnected, or the fact that the back door was unlocked, gradually strung together a much more frightening story. A scenario had been set up to distract, and the scariest thing was that it was created by the person who had once been the most trusted. The morning passed in a haze of anxiety. Hours passed and the store where Amber worked had not opened. The clock was nearing noon, and there was still no sign of the young manager. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages went unanswered. At headquarters, the delay was no longer taken lightly. Once again, Giovanni was sent to check. But this time, he was not the only one present. Brandon, another co-worker, had arrived at the store at about the same time. When they met, the door was still locked, the air still as quiet as before. However, Brandon had his own key. When they stepped inside, the first light shone through the dust on the glass door, shining directly into the chaotic space. The cash register had been thrown open. Game packaging was scattered on the floor. A few bills were scattered as if someone had dropped them in a hurry. The two stood in the room in silence, as if they hadn't yet figured out what had happened. But there was one thing that made the atmosphere heavier. Brandon didn't seem surprised. As Giovanni headed toward the back office, the door to the manager's office opened. And then, the fateful moment happened. He stopped. His eyes froze. A void filled the space. On the cold floor, Amber's body lay there, still silent, with no sign that she had ever struggled or called for help. The emergency call came soon after. Within minutes, police cars, ambulances, and investigators were there, drawing the attention of the surrounding people. The area was cordoned off. Witnesses described the chilling feeling they felt as the bad news spread like a whirlwind. A young woman, a model manager, was found dead at her workplace, in the very room where she had run her business every day. No one on the first responders would ever forget the scene. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie silence in a lifeless body. A few police officers lingered at the office door, as if trying to remember every detail. People outside whispered, unable to believe that such a terrible thing had happened in what was supposed to be a peaceful place. While everyone was still in shock, a question immediately popped into the minds of investigators. Who was the last person to see Amber alive? Immediately after the scene was sealed off, forensic experts began to approach each area of the store. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no bloodstains on the floor. But inside the management room, where Amber was found, there were details that could not be ignored. She was lying on her side at the desk, no longer breathing. A plastic bag was pulled tightly around her head, creating an initial hypothesis of asphyxiation. There were no obvious external injuries, nor signs of a violent struggle. However, upon closer examination, forensic experts discovered red marks on Amber's wrists, evidence that she had been bound with an adhesive, possibly tape, but that had been removed later. The estimated time of death was between 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., coinciding with the time when Amber usually came to open the store. One particularly striking detail was that the safe in the room had been opened, but there were no suspicious fingerprints around. Initial conclusions suggested that the perpetrator acted quickly, had knowledge of the store's structure, and even knew exactly when Amber would appear alone. There were no cameras in the area, no obvious traces left behind. But investigators knew. It was the excessive cleanliness that was most suspicious. The perpetrator was not a stranger, and this perhaps was more than just a robbery. From the very first day, the investigation team noticed something was wrong. The incident was reported as a robbery that resulted in a loss of life, but many details at the scene did not fit the usual pattern of this type of crime. Valuables were still intact, the door was not broken, and most importantly, the perpetrator seemed to have been present or had permission from the victim. Employee records were immediately reviewed. People who worked the same shift, had conflicts or acted abnormally were all put on the list. Notable among them was Brandon, Amber's assistant. She had complained to him many times about his lack of seriousness at work. According to her colleagues, Amber had planned to submit a petition to replace Brandon, and the day she died, coincidentally, was the day she intended to submit the petition. Brandon was summoned to give his statement. He admitted that he had been at the store that morning, and that he was also the person who discovered Amber's body with Giovanni. But what caught the investigators' attention was the way he described the scene, as if he had walked into a normal place, unprepared for the chaos. He said he thought the previous shift had made a mess, and since he didn't see anything too strange, he waited to open the door. Such answers did not reassure anyone. The police obtained a search warrant for Brandon's residence, but the results were surprising. No physical evidence, no suspicious evidence, no indication that he was involved in the scene. Worse, data from the carrier showed that Brandon's phone was not near the store at the time of the victim's death. He was only there around noon, which matched his testimony. Despite their suspicions, the investigators were forced to turn their attention to other relationships. Amber's boyfriend, Fred, was also considered. He was the last person to receive a text message from her, a brief declaration of love. But like Brandon, Fred was in a completely different place at the time of the incident, and witnesses and tech data confirmed it. With all leads running out, the police held a press conference hoping the community would come forward with new leads. A reward of up to $100,000 was announced, enough to motivate them. And it was through that effort that a surprising turn of events occurred. An anonymous man called in to say he had important information. At first, he was hesitant to give his testimony, but when he was invited to meet privately, he decided to share everything. According to the story, an acquaintance of his, who had worked with Amber, approached him and offered to join him in a light job. The man declined, but the next day, when he saw the news of Amber's murder, he immediately thought of his friend, Giovanni. Giovanni, who had come to inspect the store, who was the first to arrive and acted as the whistleblower, suddenly became the central figure in the investigation. The witness claimed that after the incident, Giovanni himself confessed to him that he was the one who caused Amber's death. Immediately, Giovanni was summoned, but in the interrogation room, he remained strangely calm. He insisted that he was innocent, that he was only following orders from his superiors when he came to inspect the store. When asked about his relationship with Amber, he said that the two used to be close colleagues but had little contact afterwards. Despite being questioned for hours, Giovanni did not show any weakness. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the scene. The equipment in the store did not have surveillance cameras, something that only this branch lacked. While the investigation team was still hesitant about whether the witness testimony was enough to proceed with the indictment, another turning point appeared, coming from the person closest to Giovanni, his wife. Veronica, Giovanni's wife, after a long period of silence, decided to speak up. She described how her husband changed suddenly after the day the police came to collect DNA samples. She once asked him what was going on, and he coldly said, "They suspect you of murder." That sentence was the beginning of a series of events that made Veronica unable to keep silent. She said that her husband forced her to move out of the old place, cut off contact with neighbors and family. Although initially uncertain one time, when pressed about Amber, Giovanni admitted everything. However, what made Veronica decide to report was not only the truth about the past, but also the fear for her own present and that of her children. Veronica's testimony was the most important key that the investigation team had ever had since the beginning of the case. From here, a new profile was created. Giovanni was officially wanted, but by then he had disappeared. Following a few faint leads, the police discovered his family had moved near the Mexican border. A federal arrest warrant was issued. Cooperation between domestic and foreign agencies was established. Giovanni was no longer an unknown employee. He was the target of the entire legal system. After months of tracking, Giovanni was finally arrested. He was found living at a relative's house near the Mexican border. When the authorities arrived, he did not resist and was even playing a video game, as if trying to forget what he had done. Extraditing Giovanni back to Texas was not easy. According to the rules between the U.S. and Mexico, if a suspect is extradited from the other side of the border, the death penalty is automatically taken off the table. In this situation, the prosecutor was forced to make a strategic choice: give up the maximum sentence in exchange for the opportunity to bring him to trial on U.S. soil. Giovanni was brought back quietly, without the press, without public announcement. Prosecutors knew that the case had attracted great interest and any mistake could affect the case. After reviewing all the statements from his wife, the original witness, and reanalyzing the crime scene data, they made a proposal: plead guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. The sentence was life in prison with parole after 30 years. After a few days in custody, Giovanni agreed. During a brief court hearing, he bowed his head and confessed with an almost emotionless expression. There was no apology, no explanation, just brief answers according to legal procedures. However, the court still asked him to explain what had happened. In his statement, Giovanni said that he had only intended to take the money, not to commit murder, but that explanation was not accepted. Investigators pointed out that he knew Amber would recognize him and that the act was a calculated act. The deliberate staging of the crime scene also showed the intention to cover up the crime from the beginning. When the trial ended, the atmosphere in the room was still silent. Amber's family sat back, not saying a word, but their eyes said it all. They didn't expect an apology. They just wanted to know that the person who caused that pain would never have the chance to do it again to anyone else. At the end of the trial, Giovanni was led away in silence. The courtroom doors closed, but the aftershocks of the case were still there, not only in the hearts of the victim's family, but also in the community that was shocked when it was revealed. A trial is over, but the wake-up call it left will last long after. The case ended with a harsh sentence, but the pain is not easy to erase. Amber Belkin, a young girl full of dreams and aspirations, passed away in her most familiar workplace. She used to trust her colleagues, used to start her last morning like any other normal day. But what no one expected was that trust became a fatal weakness. Her family still keeps the habit of lighting candles on every birthday. They never call it an anniversary anymore, but a reminder of a person who once lived with a loving heart. They also publicly declared that they will do everything to ensure that the perpetrator is never pardoned, even after 3 decades. As for Brandon, who was once wrongly accused, he has found his life again. He has a wife, a child, and once saved a little girl from a flood. But he still has memories of the days when he was suspected, followed, and even considered dangerous. Amber's story is more than just a case. It is a wake-up call for vigilance, trust, and the persistence of justice. Criminals are not always caught immediately, but time, community, and brave people will always be the light that illuminates the truth. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories, where justice is told through truth.